So welcome to session 2 on homeostasis. And I'll just get this into slideshow mode so we can move through the slides. And in this session, we're going to be looking at the endocrine system. So last session, we were looking at the nervous system, which has a regulatory role with regards to homeostasis. So homeostasis is keeping things level, really keeping things at a normal concentration, temperature, pressure, for example. And it's the nervous system and the endocrine system that have a role in that. So last session, we had a look at the nervous system, and this session, we're going to have a look at the gross layout, feedback mechanisms associated with the endocrine system. So let's start with having a look at some of the major structures. So the endocrine system is the organs that produce the hormones. They're made in the endocrine glands. Good example of the adrenal glands, one we're quite familiar with because they produce adrenaline. So we've all heard of adrenaline because it's the fight or flight response. So it happens quite quick. Most of these responses with the endocrine system are quite slow, but we're familiar with the endocrine response for adrenaline. So when we talk about the endocrine system, not all of these organs are technically endocrine. Some of them are exocrine glands. So these are glands that secrete hormones. Endocrine means that the hormones go into via a duct, and the exocrine, it's via a duct, and endocrine goes straight into the blood. I always muddle that up, sorry. So these structures are really, really well supplied with blood vessels because it is the blood that transports the hormones. So we've talked loads about the blood actually on this course and the components that are in the blood, and hormones are one of the things that are transported. So one of the functions of the circulatory system, if you was to list, a function of the circulatory system, transport of hormones would be up there as one of the main functions. So stuff that we're interested in terms of the endocrine system are the glands that produce the hormones and the target organs, which is where these hormones have their response. What it does is it basically enables control and regulation of body systems. It's really varied in terms of what's being controlled, but it is control of levels of something or another. So hormonal control is usually slow. So think of slow, long-term responses, puberty, pregnancy, the monthly hormonal cycle in women. So normally quite slow. It can be quite quick though, like as I've already mentioned, the effect of adrenaline is pretty rapid. So it's not all super slow. Some of it is fairly fast. But compared to the nervous system, it's very, very slow. The nervous system, you're talking fractions of a second, and the hormone distribution happens via the blood. So even the fastest distribution and response of things like adrenaline is going to be slow by comparison to the nervous system. So hormonal control is usually slow, and even the fastest response is slower than the alternative way of communication, which is the nervous system. It's the communication that is a chemical signal rather than the electrical depolarization that happens in the nervous system. This is a chemical signal that's transported in the blood, and it's detected by special receptors on target organs. And what happens then very much depends on the hormone and the target organ and the message that's being sent. But the hormonal messages bring about some sort of long-term change. Could even be a permanent change, such as puberty, which occurs in those cells that respond. So hormones are chemical messengers, chemical molecules that are synthesized in either a ductless or a endocrine gland. They're released into the blood at very, very low concentrations, and then they get picked up by special receptors on target cells. So if you have a look over here, we've got a secreting cell. This is the one that's going to release the hormones. They get released into the bloodstream. They'll go all around the body, but they'll only actually get picked up by the target cells, which will have special receptors. So they will go around other cells, but they just won't have the receptors unless they're a specific target cell for that hormone. They'll attach to the receptor on these target cells, and then they can get taken into those cells and bring about a response. So it will exert some sort of physiological response in its target cell. That's very variable. Let's have a look back to something we had a look at in one of the first, what might have actually been the first lecture. We were talking about the structure of the cell membrane, and it's got this bilayer, this double layer of phospholipids, and you can see the phospholipids there in red and orange, and there's some molecules of cholesterol in the membrane that help stabilize the membrane. They stop it getting too wobbly if it gets too hot, stop it getting too brittle if it gets too cold. We've got these transmembrane proteins that we've talked about. Specifically, we were talking last session about protein channels. We were talking about moving sodium and potassium across the membrane last session. So these proteins really important in nervous communication as well. But also some of these proteins within the cell membrane have specific receptors on their surface that enables the hormones to attach. So don't forget that membrane has got this very fluid, flexible component where bits of it can pinch off and reform and merge. I don't want to play that. Oops. So they can merge with other parts of the cell. Right, let's go back to that. Okay. So if we have a quick look at the membrane and zoom in at the phospholipid, you can see there it's got what's called a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. So hydrophilic means it's water loving, hydrophobic means it's water hating. So the tail is hydrophobic and that points inwards. You can see it here, the orange bit of the phospholipid. It points inwards into the membrane. And the reason for that is this extracellular fluid, so extracellular outside the cell, is very watery. And this cytoplasm inside the cell is also very watery. So it's a watery environment outside the cell. It's a watery environment inside the cell. So we've got the water-loving hydrophilic head, on the outside, and hydrophobic tails, water hating, pointed inwards away from the water. And that's the way the membrane structure holds. So the reason I'm telling you this is we're going to have a look at the different classes of hormones now, and it affects how they can bind to receptors in the cell and how they can move across the cell membrane. So the different types of hormones include amino acid derivatives. So there are two main groups of hormones that are derived from an amino acid called tyrosine. So amino acids, you might remember, are the building blocks for proteins. And these amino acids have modified groups on them. So they're slightly different to amino acids that are used to build proteins. They're slightly modified. Here's an example here, norepinephrine. So epinephrine is adrenaline. So it's similar to adrenaline. There are thyroid hormones. So the thyroid is found in the neck that are this type of hormone, this amino acid derivative coming from this tyrosine amino acid. And the thyroid hormones that come from the tyrosine molecules have 3 or 4 iodine atoms in them. So often when people are looking into investigating thyroid problems, they use an iodine tracer. And that will, so it's labeled, radio labeled So you can detect it because it's radioactive, and it will all accumulate in the thyroid because that's where the thyroid hormones are that incorporate the iodine are found. Then we have peptide hormones. That's our second category. These are a really big class of hormones. It's about 100 of them in total. That's because peptides are really variable. So a peptide is a chain of amino acids. So these are names of amino acids like leucine, proline, tyrosine there, which we were just talking about a minute ago. So you get a chain of amino acids, and a chain of amino acids is what proteins are made out of. But before they fold up fully, we call these chains peptides. So essentially, these are like protein hormones. They're made out of proteins, pretty much. So the polymers or chains of amino acids, they are hydrophilic and soluble in the plasma. Two examples are insulin and glucagon, which are to do with the regulation of sugar. So these peptide hormones are made at the ribosomes, which makes sense because we talked about the ribosomes as being the site of protein synthesis. So peptides are like short proteins, just not quite folded up yet to become a full protein, but they're the short chains that would become proteins. So it makes sense that these are made at the ribosomes in the endoplasmic reticulum. What happens then? They will then go to the Golgi complex. You can see the Golgi body apparatus complex. Take your pick here. Once they've been made, they go to the Golgi for packaging. Remember, we talked about the fact that proteins are made at these ribosomes, and then they can get pinched off this membrane structure that's really flexible and variable, like a lava lamp. They can move through this complex. Here's the incoming vesicle. That will then merge through these stacks. There's modification of these proteins, hormone proteins in this case, within these stacks. And then eventually, when they're ready, they will come out the other end in these vesicles here, and they can be released out into the cell. From the cell using exocytosis. That actually shows endocytosis. I've put the wrong one there. That one shows it coming into the cell. But if you imagine that arrow's reversed, it then goes out of the cell. And they can be released then into the blood to move around the body wherever they're needed. So they're hydrophilic, which means they can't cross the cell membrane because it's got that hydrophobic section to it. So what they have to do, these protein peptide hormones, is they have to attach and bind to receptors outside the cell because they can't cross the cell. And then when they bind to these receptors, it sets off a chemical message, which we say is by second messengers. So they set off a biochemical chain inside the cell. So they can't get in themselves. So it's like this, it's almost like they're pressing a switch on the outside, which causes a load of cascades to happen inside the cell when they get there. Then we have this group here of hormones called steroid hormones. And we've got two down here, which you might recognize the name of testosterone and progesterone. So testosterone, we're all quite familiar with because it's the male hormone that gives you male secondary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics are the things that make you look male. So broad shoulders, deep voice, male pattern hair distribution, so chest hair, things like that, that women don't tend to get much of at all. Then progesterone, you might have heard of as part of the female monthly cycle, but also it maintains the uterus during pregnancy. So you've probably heard of testosterone and you've probably heard of progesterone if you're a woman, maybe not if you're a man, but these are probably quite familiar names. Oxytocin, you might have heard of. This is the cuddle hormone, cwtch, as we say in Wales. It's released when you're cuddling, basically. So if you've got pets or kids or partners who you cuddle up with, you get to release of oxytocin. It's why it makes you feel good. But also you release it when you're breastfeeding. and it helps to contract the uterus after delivery. So it's, well, and during delivery, actually, it does help to contract it during, whilst going through the birth process. But also once you've given birth, and you breastfeed, the release of oxytocin helps to contract the uterus and brings everything back into shape again. But anyway, I digress. These steroid hormones here are hydrophobic, so they don't dissolve in the plasma. Hydrophobic, water hating, so hydro meaning water, phobic to hate, so hydrophobic, so they don't dissolve in the plasma, which is mostly water. And these are transported around by carrier proteins. So there's some sex hormone binding globulins. Globulin just basically is a protein that help to transport them around. So these are both considered sex hormones because testosterone and progesterone, they're to do with like reproduction. So they can pass through the cell membrane if they are lipid soluble, and then they can bind to steroid hormone receptors to bring about changes in the cell. So lots of different types of hormones, different ways of moving them around the body because of their different structures, and mostly to do with their hydrophobicity. So whether they're water soluble or not, because of the whether they can dissolve in the plasma and whether they can pass through that membrane. But we'll have a little look at that next session in more detail, that those transport mechanisms and, well, more the target cell mechanisms next session. So let's have a look at some of the common hormones that we might have heard about that are of importance in the body. So first one is adrenaline. That comes from the adrenal gland, which is just up and behind the kidneys. And what it does is it readies the body for fight or flight. So you've probably heard of the fight or flight response. And it does that by increasing your heart rate. Makes sense. Gets more oxygen to your muscles. If you've got to fight or run, you want lots of oxygen in your muscles. It increases your breathing rate. Makes sense. The faster you breathe, the more oxygen you take in, which can then go straight to your muscles. Dilates the blood vessels. Makes sense. Fight or flight response. You dilate those blood vessels, you're making the lumen larger, more blood can travel through, get to those muscles that need all that oxygen to help you run away or fight your way out of the scenario you found yourself in. Then we have insulin, which we've talked about briefly before. This comes from the pancreas. It lowers blood glucose levels. It does this by converting glucose into glycogen, and that glycogen is then stored in the liver and the muscles until we need some more glucose, and we can turn that glycogen back to glucose then. So it takes glucose out of our blood and stores it up as glycogen. That's the role of insulin. And testosterone, as I mentioned earlier, this is from the testes. It's the male sex hormone, and it's responsible for the development of male secondary sexual characteristics. So growing a beard, having a broad chest, chest hair, deep voice, that sort of thing. And progesterone is a female hormone. It's produced in the ovaries. It maintains the lining of the uterus during the menstrual cycle, and it helps to maintain pregnancy also by maintaining the lining of the uterus. Then we have estrogen, another female hormone, and this is important for the development of female secondary sexual characteristics. So development of breasts, widening of the hips, things like that, that help you, well, they essentially they're puberty hormones that make you develop into an adult female. And it also has roles in controlling the menstrual cycle. So let's have a look at how some of these hormones work then. Let's have a look at glycogenesis. Glycogenesis involves the hormone insulin, which comes from the pancreas. It comes from specialized cells in the pancreas called beta cells. So if you get a higher than normal glucose level, it triggers these specialized beta cells in the pancreas from a region called the islets of Langerhans. They're Langerhans, again, just some guy who discovered this structure when dissecting pancreases. So the glucose, if it's higher than normal in the blood, it triggers these beta cells to release insulin that gets released into the bloodstream. What it does is it stimulates the liver and the muscle cells to take up the excess glucose from the bloodstream and convert it into glycogen. So glucose, you can see here, 6-carbon sugar. Glycogen is a more complex chain of glucose. And this way, the glycogen or the glucose molecules, when they're linked together, is stored. The reason this happens is storing glucose in the cells would be dangerous because it exerts an osmotic pull, and this would result in water rushing into the cells. This is a red blood cell here, but it's the same for all animal cells. It would cause water to rush in if they were full of sugar, and it would cause them to burst. This is called cell lysis. This lysis would happen because there's no cell wall in animal cells. And if there was loads of sugar in a cell, loads of water would move in by osmosis because of this osmotic pressure. And they would just pop. So that's why we need to not store glucose, but we need to have glycogenesis to produce glycogen to store our glucose that way. We've got to store it because we need to have it on hand, if possible, for respiration. So glucose is one of the reactants for respiration, glucose and oxygen. I mean, obviously we get the oxygen in by just constantly breathing, but we don't get the glucose in by constantly eating. So we need to store it up, ready for use. Let me just check the chat there. That's okay. Nothing, no questions. It's all right. Okay, so we need to just store that up for use. So too much glucose in the blood, the pancreas will produce insulin, which enters the blood. This is the blood vessel here. Look, that's a little red blood cell. That's the insulin. That's our sugar. Sugar's usually drawn as a hexagon because it's a 6-carbon molecule. That insulin then allows the glucose to be absorbed by the body cells, converted into glycogen, and the blood glucose is reduced, and we no longer release insulin. We can then, if we need glucose, for example, it's been a while since we've eaten, there's no sugars going around in our blood, we need to do some exercise. We can, if the blood glucose levels fall, release a hormone called glucagon. This comes from pancreas, the pancreas again, pancreatic alpha cells this time, not beta cells, alpha cells this time. And glucagon causes the liver cells to convert this glycogen back into glucose. This is in the reverse direction. This is called glycogen lysis. Lysis is to split. So glycogen splitting, glycogen lysis, because we talked about cell lysis a minute ago, splitting the cell or bursting the cell. And then this glucose can be released back into the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, it can be used for cellular respiration along with the oxygen that we breathe in our breaths. My friend's got pancreatitis, but I forgot what caused it. It would usually flare up in her monthly cycle as well at the time of the month. Right, okay, so pancreatitis, just anything itis just means inflammation of. So she's got inflammation of her pancreas for some reason. So not sure, maybe she's got an infection or something, I don't know. But nasty, pancreas is really important. You can't survive without them. So they're really important. Excuse me. Right. If we need more glucose than we've actually got stored in glycogen, we can use fats and proteins for respiration. So there is stuff that we can do. Is we don't just drop dead if we've run out of glycogen. We can use stored reserves of fats and proteins. So eventually we drop dead if we don't eat, obviously, but it's not like breathing where if we run out of oxygen, we're really in trouble. We can keep going for quite some time without glucose. It takes a while to start. So quite a few names that sound quite similar here. So Glucose is the substrate for cellular respiration. So glucose plus oxygen reacts in a very big pathway to give us energy, to release energy. Then we've got glycogen, which is how glucose is stored in animals and fungi for that matter. It's stored as starch in plants, just for information, which is why we eat loads of plants. You know, we eat things like rice, potatoes, grains. They're all full of starch, which is basically molecules like this, where glucose is joined together in chains. So it's worth us eating it to get hold of these glucose molecules. And then we've got glucagon, which is the hormone. And this is what stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose. So it's quite a few similar names there. And then we've got glycogen genesis and glycogen lysis as well as the names of the processes. So it's a bit of a tricky name topic, this one, unfortunately. Okay, going to have a look at another hormone now. This is the one that's involved in regulating blood water levels. So don't forget what all of these hormones are doing is they're keeping levels constant. So the insulin one we were just looking at is about keeping our blood glucose levels normal. Well, adrenaline, I suppose that's not really about regulating much. That's fight or flight. But this one's another regulation one. So if we've got too little water in our blood, so perhaps we're not properly hydrated, haven't had a drink for a while, or maybe we've lost a load of water due to sweat because we've been exercising really hard or it's a hot day. What happens is hypothalamus in the brain will detect that your water level is too low, and then it will send a message to the pituitary gland, which is also in the brain, and that releases a hormone called ADH. It stands for antidiuretic hormone, and that means more water will be reabsorbed in the kidneys. It's reabsorbed from the blood. So the blood passes through the kidneys and they filter stuff that you don't need out. So we release our extra water, it goes to the bladder and we urinate. It's excretion, we excrete it. We get rid of urea as well, which comes from the deamination process in the liver that we looked at a few weeks ago. So the water, the blood goes through the kidneys, and then if we haven't had a drink for a while, the pituitary gland releases antidiuretic hormones. And rather than releasing a load of water in our urine, we reabsorb more due to this antidiuretic hormone. And then because we've reabsorbed more water, less water is lost in the urine, then our blood level will return to normal. If we then have a really big drink because we're feeling quite thirsty, we'll end up with too much water in our blood. And our hypothalamus will detect our water level, send a message to the pituitary gland to actually release less antidiuretic hormone now. And if we release less antidiuretic hormone, less water is reabsorbed by the kidneys, reabsorbed from the blood. And if we're reabsorbing less water, there's only one place for it to go, and that's into the bladder. And we'll get rid of that water then in the urine. That makes sense. The more you drink, the more you excrete as urine. And if you could have a look at these arrows, actually, they're forming a sort of sine wave, like a wiggly line. And that's kind of those lines we were looking at last session that go about that, flat level that we're trying to stay at. So if your water levels get too low, you reabsorb more water. If your water levels get too high, you reabsorb less water and urinate more. And that hormone is antidiuretic hormone. So a diuretic is something that makes you urinate more. So if you have an antidiuretic hormone, you urinate less. So a good example of a diuretic is dandelions. Probably we're told in primary school, don't pick dandelions, you'll wet the bed. You're not really going to wet the bed from picking them, but you probably might urinate a bit more if you eat them. You can eat dandelion leaves, by the way. So dandelions are a diuretic, and they have the same effect of releasing less antidiuretic hormone. Um, less water is reabsorbed by the kidneys, and more water gets lost in the urine as a result. Okay, let's have a little look at the sex hormones then. So, secondary sexual characteristics. Puberty, as we know, is when a child's body develops into an adult. It happens usually between the ages of about 10 and 16. This is actually getting younger, between the ages of sort of 8 and probably 14 is more realistic. The better our nutrition and the heavier we get, the earlier puberty is becoming in the Western world. These changes are occurring due to the hormones testosterone and estrogen. And testosterone is produced in the testes and controls the development of male secondary sexual characteristics. Estrogen is produced in the ovaries and is essentially doing the same for females, controlling the development of female secondary sexual characteristics. So, what we mean by sexual characteristics are pubic hair growth, underarm hair growth, that happens in males and females, and the development of sexual organs. So they grow and develop. So those are common to both male and female, but males get a deepening voice, which deepens suddenly. They get hair on the face and on the body. The body becomes more muscular, significantly so compared to the woman, and the testes start to produce sperm cells. Female's voice deepens as well, but it's much more gradually and it doesn't get as deep. The male voice deepens very quickly and gets a lot deeper. The female's hips get wider. This helps to deliver the baby when during delivery if she becomes pregnant. Breasts develop. These are obviously for feeding babies, and the ovaries start to release eggs, and menstruation starts. So let's have a look at the female reproductive organs. It's important that you can tell what's what from both angles here, because I think we're quite familiar with this angle from school, but wouldn't necessarily have seen this angle so frequently. So we have the oviduct or fallopian tube, same thing, it's just got two names, which is always fun in biology, which is this big long tube here from the ovary down to the uterus. But you can't really see it very well from the side here because it's kind of side on. This is the ovary and this is the fallopian tube here. So the ovary contain the eggs or ova, and these are the female gametes or sex cells. And women have all of their ova that they're going to have from birth. Males produce sperm continually. So each ovary is connected to the uterus. So the uterus is where the fetus will develop if pregnancy occurs. So each ovary is connected by a fallopian tube or the oviduct to this uterus. These are lined with ciliated cells that we've talked about quite a few times, and these help to move the eggs once they're released once a month down into the uterus. And if pregnancy occurs, the embryo and fetus will then develop in the uterus. So the egg has to make its way from here down to the uterus and it becomes fertilized. That happens in the fallopian tube. So the uterus is, as I said, is where the baby develops. At the bottom of the uterus, we have the cervix. This is a ring of muscle. It's a circular muscle, so it's really squeezed tight, and then it opens up when the baby comes out, and then has to open up quite large, that sort of size. And that's what they talk about when they're talking about somebody being dilated. Normally that's closed really tight and it opens up to about 10 centimeters. What it does, this muscle, is it separates the vagina, which is this opening here, from the uterus. So that's the whole birth canal. The vagina is a muscular tube and it leads to the outside of the body. And obviously this is where the penis is inserted during intercourse and sperm has to be released to get up to here. So it's quite a long journey up to the fallopian tube. So the outside of the vagina is called the vulva, and that's where, if you have a look over here, we have the bladder and the urethra, and then just behind it we have the vagina. So there's separate openings for the urethra, which releases the urine, the vagina, which leads to the uterus, and that's the anus at the back there, which leads to the rectum and the large intestine. So it looks a bit weird, admittedly, from the side, but learn to sort of looking at there. Okay, so that's that. So male reproductive system is probably a little less complex in terms of internal structures. There's not a huge amount in there, really. Everything's on the outside. You have the two testes, which are held in a sac of skin, which is called the scrotum. They're held outside just to keep them a little bit cooler than body temperature, which is optimal for sperm production. The testes also produce the testosterone. So the sperm, once it's produced, moves through sperm ducts where they're mixed with fluids from glands called seminal vesicles. You can see here, here's the testes where the sperm production is, and then there are fluids released along here as well. And those fluids mixed together with the sperm produce what we call semen. So this penis has two functions. So unlike the women's reproductive system we were just looking at, where we have the vagina and the urethra separate, with the men, the urethra has one tube for urine and for semen to be passed into the female. There's a ring of muscle that keeps the two things separate, but both in the same structure. Right, let's have a look at the female reproductive system. So the menstrual cycle is a repeating process which takes approximately 28 days. It's variable. It can vary from person to person. It can vary from month to month in the same person. So it's approximately 28 days. Now, during this process, what is happening is the uterus is being prepared for pregnancy every single month. Now, most women only get pregnant maybe 2, 3, 4, quite a lot times. When I say quite a lot, it's quite a lot for now. The average number in this country, the average number of children that women have in the UK is less than 2 now, but obviously not every pregnancy is viable. Many women will have pregnancies that end in spontaneous abortion, which is a miscarriage. So most women probably only getting pregnant maybe 2 or 3 times in their life, but this is happening every single month. So what's happening is we're preparing for pregnancy just in case, and the uterus is essentially being prepared. So this here is the uterus, and you can see this is in a phase called menses, which is what we commonly refer to as the period or the time of the month. So this is when the woman is shedding the lining of her uterus, which was built up over the previous month. What's happening here is the egg is developing, and then we get to halfway through the reproductive cycle, and this is the phase of ovulation. So you can see the lining of the uterus has been thickening, building up, preparing for pregnancy. Then we get to this phase, the lining is actually really quite thick because the woman has just ovulated, and should she become pregnant in this second half of her cycle, her uterus lining needs to be prepared for embedding of the fertilized egg. So it's really thick lining of the uterus there. If pregnancy doesn't occur, which is nearly every single month, pregnancy doesn't occur, the uterus lining will break down. We don't need to maintain that lining of the uterus if there's no pregnancy. and that uterus lining is shed, sorry. So you're not just bleeding, you are losing actual tissue. The lining of a organ is being shed during menstruation, which is also known as a period. So there's lots of hormones that are levels that are rising and falling during this time. So estrogen is produced in the ovaries and it causes the lining of the uterus to thicken. That's what we were just looking at here. So it's shed during the period or menses, and it's thickening here to prepare for embedding of the fertilized egg into the walls. So the estrogen, which causes the lining to thicken, is stimulated by the release of another hormone, LH, stands for luteinizing hormone. And this also causes the release of an egg. So if we have a look at luteinizing hormone, which is pink on this graph, you can see there's not a lot going on. It's all pretty calm. And then we get a really big peak of luteinizing hormone just before ovulation. So this mark here is ovulation, the release of the egg. So a huge peak of luteinizing hormone, and then the egg is released, and then that goes back down again. And that's causing the also the estrogen to rise and thicken the walls of the uterus. Progesterone, which is the purple line on the graph, is also produced in the ovaries, and it maintains the lining of the uterus. So it keeps that lining thick after the ovaries, the estrogen has caused it to thicken. The progesterone keeps it thick. And then you get a dip, and then menstruation happens at the end of the month, starting a new cycle. But if you become pregnant during this phase, that progesterone level stays high and it maintains the lining of the uterus throughout the pregnancy, because obviously you need that uterus there. So there's two sections. There's one section called the follicular phase and another section called the luteal phase. These are the two hormones that are controlling these other hormones. So the FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And then the middle bit is ovulation. So follicular phase and luteal phase there. So the follicle stimulating hormone is released from the pituitary, and in response to the release of this FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, a follicle in the ovary, which is kind of like a case containing an egg. They look like this, yeah. So that's the egg, the ovum is really small. This outside sort of sac is called a follicle. So the follicle in the ovary will undergo some changes. It'll start to mature, and then maturation takes place in the middle of the cycle, ovulation, and the ovum or egg is released. Estrogen is released in response to these levels of follicle stimulating hormone. And as the levels of estrogen increase, they cause a decrease in follicle stimulating hormone. So estrogen in gray goes up, follicle stimulating hormone goes down. You can see the levels lower down here. And this also leads to an increase in luteinizing hormone. The peak in luteinizing hormone, as we saw, the pink one, triggers ovulation. So all of these hormones are interacting in a quite complex way to get that egg matured, to get that egg released, and to get the uterus prepared for embedding that fertilized egg. So once, where are we? So the follicle, which has released the egg, has to be got rid of, because we only want the egg bit of it. We don't want the sort of little case that was contained in it. It forms a structure called the corpus luteum in the ovary. This also produces progesterone. And obviously, as we were saying earlier, this helps to maintain the uterus, and it also inhibits follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone and ends that ovulation period. So we go into this, are we pregnant or not period, basically at the end of this. We're ready to go with this big spike of progesterone to maintain the lining if we are pregnant. Otherwise, there we go again, another cycle for next month. So if pregnancy does occur, the sperm is released into the vagina. It makes its way through this tight ring, the cervix, up through the uterus, and fertilizes the egg in the fallopian tube or the oviduct. So you don't actually get pregnant during intercourse. You probably get pregnant 5 days later when you're walking around Tesco's or something. So it takes a while for that sperm to get all the way to the egg and fuse with it. Then, after 40 weeks of taking all of your nutrients and oxygen, you get the joys of giving birth. What happens is the baby lies in the uterus towards the end of the pregnancy with its head pointing towards the vagina, the birth control canal, and the amniotic sac ruptures. That's when the amniotic fluid, which surrounds the fetus, will be released, and people talk about waters breaking. So a lot of fluid will pass through the vagina. That's no longer needed to protect the baby as it's being born. So that will escape through the woman's vagina. Baby, hopefully, at this point, is lying head first, so with its head against the cervix, and then it will have to exert muscular action to get its head in place. And the uterus contracts, not massively to start with, quite slowly, but this will help to move the baby into place. If the baby's not in that way up, you might end up having to have it taken out with a cesarean section because it's really difficult to get it out if it's upside down or something. So once the head is in position, hopefully at the top of the cervix, the contractions start to happen. The hormone oxytocin has got an important role. It's secreted by the pituitary gland and it causes the contractions of the uterus. And once the head has entered the vaginal canal, the birth quickly takes place. Well, that's debatable, but supposedly quickly takes place. It can take a long time. It's really painful, and it's can often need intervention from medical teams. But supposedly, if everything's going well, once the head is in the vaginal canal, it happens quite quickly. The bones in the baby's skull aren't completely ossified, so the head is quite soft. That allows some flexibility to get the head through. So there's very strong contractions which allow that baby to be pushed out. Once the baby has begun to breathe, then it no longer needs the placenta to supply oxygen, and the umbilical cord can be clipped. And then the placenta as if that's not enough, then the placenta has to be delivered as well. So you then have to deliver a whole organ out through the birth canal. So that's nowhere near as painful or as horrific as giving birth because it's much softer. It's just an organ, but still has to be taken out. Happens by further contractions of the uterus. So not particularly easy process, no matter how it says it happens really quickly, it can take a very long time and is particularly exhausting for the mother. Humans are on the verge of not fitting the baby out through the birth canal. We're on the absolute limit of the size of our offspring. We're on the absolute limit of fitting through that birth canal. So it's not an easy birth for our species. Okay, let's have a look. So, which of the following anchors the fetus in place? We didn't actually go over that. That's because that wasn't part of this topic, but you might know. Which of the following is not part of the female reproductive system? Where are the female gametes produced? So that's the ova. and where is the site of fertilization in humans? Have a look at those and see what you think is the correct answer. You can pause the video if you're watching the recording and press play when you're ready to have a look at the answers. If you guys want to, in the session, you can pop the answers in the chat. Okay, well done. Okay, I'll put those answers up for you. I think everyone's done writing. So it's the umbilical cord that anchors the fetus in place. It's anchored to the placenta. The scrotum is part of the male reproductive system rather than female. Female gametes are produced in the ovaries. The female gametes are the eggs, the ova. And the site of fertilization is the fallopian tube or the oviduct, if you prefer. Let's have a look at the next one. Right. What's the role of the placenta? What's the role of progesterone? Which of the following is not a male secondary sexual characteristic? And which hormone is responsible for the development of male secondary sexual characteristics? So have a go in the chat, or if you're watching the recording, obviously you can pause the video, press play when you're ready to go. Just open the chat. Mostly agreeing there, guys. Let's have a look at your answers. So, what's the role of the placenta? It is to allow exchange of nutrients, oxygen, and waste between the mother and fetus. The role of progesterone is to maintain the lining of the uterus. So it does this during the menstrual cycle, and if pregnancy occurs, it helps as well throughout the pregnancy. Widening of the hips is not a male secondary sexual characteristic, but it occurs in females. So our legs are on a slightly different angle. So our knees are a little bit different, male and female, which means that women can't run quite as fast as men. There's not much difference in it. It's only sort of seconds, fractions of a second almost over short distances. But women can't quite run as fast as men of the same size because of the way the hip develops. Which hormone is responsible for the development of male secondary sexual characteristics? It is testosterone. So all of those male characteristics, beard, chest hairs, deep voice. Okay, so we've had a look on homeostatic regulation of systems such as temperature regulation, glucose regulation, and water regulation. And last session, we had a look at the nervous system. Next session, we're moving on to have a look at how some of those hormones we mentioned today can trigger response by binding outside of the cell. So any questions, guys? Okay, if not, I will see you on Saturday. Bye, everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.